This episode was suggested by a listener, Allison, on Facebook. Surprise! I hope this cheers you up. If you'd like to suggest a topic, you can do so on Twitter @Morbid Podcast, on Facebook and Instagram @Morbid Curiosity Podcast, and on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. On the last episode of the MCP, we talked about the unfair treatment of one woman who was thought to be a danger to public health, Mary Mallon. It was a complicated issue with many perspectives and no ideal solutions. In this episode, we're going to talk about many women who were treated unfairly, because they too were blamed for a larger public health issue. This situation is even more complex and occurred around 50 years before Typhoid Mary. Before we get into this topic, I want to remind everyone that this occurred over 100 years ago, during a time when the scientific method was just beginning to gain traction. Medicine was just starting to help rather than hinder, and ideas about what was socially acceptable were very different from the ideas of today. In much of the written resources on this topic, the concept of morality, decency, and criminality were delineated by upper-class white Christians. The lower classes, who were most affected by the laws we're going to talk about, were generally unable to read or write, so their views on this subject remain obscured. This is a form of cultural bias, which we've talked about in previous episodes, but in this case, it's a culture within a culture that's being observed and made assumptions about. This episode discusses sexually transmitted infections and forced gynecological examinations. If that's not something you want to hear about, this may be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so, the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. During the Victorian period, the British Empire was in the midst of what some historians call its imperial century. Between 1815 and 1914, Britain gained around 10 million square miles, or 26 million square kilometers of territory, and around 400 million people due to its colonial efforts. They were unchallenged at sea thanks to a large navy, and their armies were garrisoned in force in all of their colonies and territories. The inventions of the steamship and the telegraph aided them in moving quickly and communicating, giving them a distinct advantage. Between 1854 and 1856, the Crimean War raged, in which an alliance of Britain, France, Sardinia, and the Ottoman Empire defeated Russia over religious differences. With the aid of the East India Company, Britain had advanced into Asia and in 1858 took control of India, giving Queen Victoria the title of Empress of India. The British were also expanding in Africa and China. Throughout this expansion, the army and navy were constantly at battle, and the health of the soldiers was key in keeping them fighting fit, not just abroad, but also at home. Thanks to the Crimean War, the state of the armed forces came under scrutiny. In 1862, a parliamentary commission was established to inquire into the prevalence of sexually transmitted infections, then called venereal diseases, among the armed forces in Britain and abroad in their colonial territories. This royal commission exposed many issues, such as poor living conditions, and the fact that the restrictions on soldiers being married was creating a bachelor army. This last issue led to rampant venereal infections due to the soldiers' visits to brothels during their leave, and was considered to be the most serious. It was found that soldiers and seamen alike were inundated with syphilis and gonorrhea, and anxiety over the state of their health grew. If they were too sick to fight, how could the empire stay in control of its territories? Venereal disease was only just becoming a topic the British medical community was comfortable talking about, being that it was spread through sexual activity, which was traditionally a taboo subject. There's a generalized view of Victorian society being incredibly repressive when it came to sexuality, but these repressive standards were mostly just the views of the upper middle class and the aristocracy. The working and lower class had less rigid social standards when it came to sexuality, but again, their views on the subject are not as well known, thanks to a lack of primary sources from that area of society. Because of the high rates of venereal disease found in garrison towns and seaports, as revealed by the Royal Commission, the armed forces appeared to be in peril, and doctors alone had so far had little effect in controlling the disease on their own. Therefore, the officers and the upper-class men in Parliament felt regulation was required to deal with the impending epidemic. At this time, the majority of people, including those in charge of the Army and Navy, assumed venereal infections were spread by prostitutes, and therefore prostitutes were blamed for it. Also at this time, the word prostitute vaguely referred to females that were paid for sex in any capacity, be it their profession or something they did occasionally out of financial necessity. It could also refer to a woman who had sex before marriage or lived with a man out of wedlock, which was not uncommon among the lower classes, but would have been viewed as scandalous to the middle and upper classes. Prostitutes could be found in most cities, usually in small sections of the city. For example, in London, ladies of the night haunted the streets of Charing Cross, the Haymarket, Regent Street, and the West End. Prostitution wasn't officially illegal, but it was seen as socially unacceptable. Despite this, it persisted. There were prostitutes in every social class, from the kept mistresses of the elite to the women who walked the streets at night. Because of its pervasiveness in all levels of society, prostitution was considered a social evil, and therefore drew attention from various groups who wanted to put an end to it, including the church, the government, medical scientists, philanthropists, and feminist groups, each offering a different opinion on how best to control and end it. The many fears surrounding prostitution included the idea that it would infect the respectable world with disease, destroy marriages, and the nation's safety. These same fears existed in other parts of the world too. In Britain, there had been attempts made by some of the groups I mentioned to reform prostitutes through education and employment. This was due to a shift from thinking prostitutes were responsible for their own misfortunes to thinking of them as victims of social injustice. Whatever the sentiment, the attempts at reform were either too slow or ineffective. Therefore, attempts at prevention and regulation began. In Europe, police-regulated prostitution had already gone into effect and seemed to have improved safety on the city streets and offered protection from the disease. This type of regulation was also undertaken in several British colonial territories. The most significant and likely the inspiration for later regulation in Britain occurred in Malta in 1861. These regulations, called Ordinance 4, were set down by Sir Henry Storks, then governor of Malta. Sir Storks claimed venereal disease was eradicated during his time as Lord High Commissioner of the Ionian Islands through similar regulation. These regulations included identifying prostitutes, inspecting them for disease periodically, and treating them or imprisoning them for it. Likely taking inspiration from these colonial trial runs, similar measures were quietly discussed in Parliament for Britain. In 1864, the Contagious Disease Act was passed by Parliament, along with several other acts pertaining to the spread of disease in cattle. This would be the first of 3 acts that were intended to stop the spread of venereal diseases by regulating prostitution. The 1864 Act set up the basic system of regulation, first creating special hospitals, or delegating specific wards in general hospitals, called lock hospitals or lock wards, that were specifically meant to treat venereal cases. At the time, most general hospitals refused to treat people with these diseases, partly because they were highly contagious, and partly because the victim was seen as deserving of their disease for having sex with prostitutes. The Act also appointed an inspector of these lock hospitals, and a committee of inquiry, both appointed by the Admiralty and the Secretary of the State for War. Second, special plainclothes police officers were appointed to identify and notify any woman he believed to be a common prostitute. Any woman accused of prostitution must submit to an internal genital examination by a medical doctor at one of the lock hospitals. This order for examination was also a warrant for any officer to apprehend the woman and take her to the hospital if she refused. While at the hospital, if the woman still refused to be examined, the penalty was imprisonment for 1 month. If she refused again, the penalty was 2 months in prison. If, after examination, the woman was found to have a venereal disease, she was detained in the hospital for treatment for no more than 3 months, or until she was cured. Thirdly, any brothel found to hold a woman with venereal disease had to pay a penalty of no more than £10, around £1,200 in today's currency, and the proprietor faced imprisonment for 3 months. The Contagious Disease Act applied to only 4 cities, which were chosen based on their status as garrison or naval towns. The act was set to be in place for 3 years, after which time it would be reassessed in order to determine if it was effective and also to address any issues with its implementation. 2 years later, in 1866, a year before the reassessment was to take place, the Contagious Disease Acts were extended to 9 more towns. Their duration was also extended, and several more provisions were added, such as the jurisdiction stretching to the areas around the selected towns in a 5-mile radius. Including the small towns and parishes that were within the radius of the designated towns, over 75 towns were now affected by the acts. Women who had been registered as prostitutes through the original act also now had to submit to examination every 3 months. Lock hospitals and wards were also granted their own specific doctors, nurses, orderlies, and chaplains. This was done to further prevent the spread of infection between hospitals and wards. In 1869, the Contagious Disease Acts were extended again. 6 more towns were brought under its jurisdiction. Also with this extension, the prison sentence for women who refused to be examined was more than doubled to 6 months. The acts were all paid for by British taxpayers, both male and female, most of which had no idea the Contagious Disease Acts even existed. Also, the acts weren't just implemented in Britain, but also in some of their colonial territories, including Australia, where it went into effect in Queensland in 1868 and in Tasmania in 1879. There are several immediate issues with the Contagious Disease Acts. As I mentioned earlier, common prostitute was a vague term. Identification of a prostitute, therefore, depended on the special constable's opinion on whether a woman was acting like a prostitute or not. To verify their suspicions, the constables were given leave to watch any women on the street near dusk, and if they judged that that woman was acting in a way that he felt suggested she was a prostitute, he would notify her. She was then expected to submit voluntarily to an examination by a doctor. These pelvic examinations were invasive, involved a metal speculum, and would have been performed by a male doctor, as there were few women in the medical profession at this time. If the woman refused, she was jailed. A wrongful accusation of prostitution put innocent women through this process and was also enough to tarnish their reputations, which at the time could affect their entire lives. The lock hospitals mentioned in the Contagious Disease Acts were hospitals that were exclusively for the treatment of contagious disease, usually venereal disease or leprosy. Both the patients and staff were isolated or locked off from other patients. Some of these hospitals were already in existence at this time, but were small and publicly funded through donations. As the people who could afford to donate felt venereal diseases were self-inflicted, lock hospitals didn't receive much funding, and therefore were often lacking in the means to treat anyone. With the Contagious Disease Acts, these hospitals and several new ones became funded by the government. The facilities improved, But as many of the new patients were sent to the hospitals by the Acts and were examined and kept there against their will, the term soon became synonymous with a medical prison. Thirdly, at this time, curing venereal diseases was tricky, as there was no known 100% effective treatment for syphilis or gonorrhea. The treatment that was used most often was mercury, even though doctors knew of the ill effects that came with extended use, and the fact that it didn't always work. Also at this time, doctors believed a person was cured when their physical symptoms disappeared. As we know from the syphilis episode of the MCP, syphilis has 3 stages, and between each stage is a time when symptoms disappear, but the infected person is still contagious. Therefore, these treatments were likely ineffective, and also probably caused more harm than good. As you might imagine, the Contagious Disease Acts brought on quite a reaction from the public. But before we get into that, let's have a quick word from our sponsors. Our regular sponsor is Audible.com. Audible can provide you with interesting and engaging audiobooks. In fact, there are over 180,000 of them to choose from, which you can listen to on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 players. MCP listeners can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial of Audible.com by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. You can also find this link on our Facebook page and website. If you sign up for the free trial, you get a free audiobook that is yours to keep, even if you cancel the service as soon as you finish downloading it. And the MCP gets the funding it needs to keep bringing morbid history to your ears. So go get your free audiobook on us. Lastly, if you like this podcast, why not sponsor the MCP yourself by becoming a patron on Patreon? There are several tiers of patronage, the lowest being $1 an episode. With that dollar, you become eligible for several rewards, such as access to our patron-only feed and being entered in a monthly raffle. When you become a patron, it helps us keep this show going. If more people become patrons, we may even be able to eliminate the need for sponsors. That means no break in the middle of the show. If you'd like to become a patron, go to bit.ly/morbidpatron. That's bit.ly/morbidpatron, and you'll be directed to our Patreon page, where you can choose your rewards. You'll have our eternal gratitude. And now, back to the podcast. At first, most people paid little attention to the Contagious Disease Acts, as they were passed rather quietly, and the name was quite generalized for what the Acts were attempting to do, which was regulate prostitution in Britain. Administration of the Acts was also complex and hard to follow. The creation and maintenance of the Acts was overseen by the Admiralty and the War Office, but the Metropolitan Police were employed to identify and bring in the suspected prostitutes, and then provincial magistrates, hospitals, and doctors were relied on to examine and treat them. To the public, there didn't seem to be a single entity in charge. This was not the first attempt at regulating prostitution. Local authorities in certain military towns or naval bases, as well as the university towns of Oxford and Cambridge, had instituted their own elements of regulation before these acts were passed. Cambridge especially had a special team of proctors that policed the streets, detaining, inspecting, and sometimes imprisoning women who were seen with students after dark. They had their own detention center for these women, called the Spinning House. Several female philanthropists and women involved in the women's suffrage movement were immediately outraged. Florence Nightingale, who had served in the Crimean War as a nurse and was an advocate of women's health and education, was outraged when she heard about the Contagious Disease Acts. Elizabeth Wolstenholme, a suffragette, attended a meeting in opposition of the acts in 1869 and was also deeply affected. She told her good friend Josephine Butler, a well-known advocate of poor women and prostitutes. Organized public opposition didn't really surface until 1869, when Parliament hoped to extend the Contagious Disease Acts to the north of England. The first public criticism came from Dr. Charles Bell Taylor and Mr. Charles Worth, both surgeons, who raised opposition to the fact that the acts were passed without the knowledge of the public and without the input of a single woman. A coalition of middle-class people, feminists, and working-class men challenged it, and that year, the National Association for the Repeal of the Contagious Disease Acts formed to fight the acts. This group quickly began an information-based campaign, publishing pamphlets and reports on the ills of the Contagious Disease Acts. Unfortunately, the National Association did not allow women to join at first. Remember, this was a time when women did not yet have the right to vote, and according to traditional societal norms, were not supposed to engage in any politics, and definitely not supposed to speak about anything as undignified as prostitution or sex. Despite these barriers, a women's movement was growing, and it rallied against the acts and their treatment of women in the form of the Ladies' National Association for the Repeal of the Contagious Disease Acts, or the LNA. The LNA was formed and run by Josephine Butler, with the help of James Stansfeld and Henry J. Wilson. Around this time, the lives of the lower classes were becoming more visible to the middle class, thanks to a rise in philanthropy, which in turn was due to the rising moralist movement. One of these great philanthropists was Josephine Butler, who founded several houses of rest where she took in dying prostitutes and cared for them. She also championed women's education and employment, and was therefore part of the growing women's movement in Britain. Butler, who had witnessed the hardships of the lower classes through her charity work, took on the Contagious Disease Acts with fierce enthusiasm. She spent her own money and raised even more towards the repeal effort. She insisted that there must be a female perspective in the repeal movement, because that was who the Contagious Disease Acts affected most. She was able to mobilize other middle-class women to defend their working-class counterparts. This was one of the first instances of women coming together to make their voices heard in the political arena. At the time, women acting in this way was considered shocking, and the LNA was nicknamed the Shrieking Sisterhood and viewed as disgraceful by many of the more traditional men of Parliament. James Stansfeld was a less traditional member of Parliament, representing Halifax from 1859 to 1895. He was also a Unitarian, a religion that proposes that every person, no matter their gender, race, or background, deserves to be treated with dignity. He was considered radical for supporting women's suffrage and medical education, and became the voice of the LNA in Parliament. Henry J. Wilson was a steel industrialist from Sheffield, and became the logistical workhorse of the LNA and several other organizations for the repeal of the acts. He organized rallies, the spread of information about the acts among the middle class, and cultivated political contacts. He also kept a detailed chronology of all repeal activities and a bibliography of all the literature they produced. Besides the National Association and the LNA, there were many other organizations created in opposition of the Contagious Disease Acts, showing the many different camps that found it offensive. There were groups based on ideology, morality, class, region, gender, and occupation. And even though these groups had many underlying issues with one another, they were able to see past those issues in order to support the repeal of the acts. Their coalition also encouraged discussion on social, medical, and political issues, such as women in politics, and what role the government should play, if any, in enforcing sexual and social discipline. The main issues these groups had with the Contagious Disease Acts were its aggressiveness toward women, the double standard they represented, in which women were examined but men were not, and the fact that the acts basically sanctioned what all of these groups referred to as male vice. They justified male sexual access and penalized women for engaging in the same vice. The acts were also viewed as an abuse of the Constitution and an abuse of the lower classes by the higher classes. Finally, the acts assumed soldiers were half-wild cast-offs of society who were incapable of sating their lust. On the other side of the issue were the members of the aristocracy, both male and female, the military, and the medical establishment. In 1867, the Association for Promoting the Extension of the Contagious Disease Acts was established. They were just as prominent in the publishing of pamphlets and articles as the opposition groups. They strongly campaigned for the extension of the acts all over Britain, believing it was the best way to regulate prostitution. They also suggested that prostitutes protected young virtuous women from predation by men, as well as gave wives relief from the burden of constantly seeing to the sexual needs of their husbands. Again, please remember at this time, the traditional social role of upper-class women did not include sex, except in the context of bearing children. The military saw the acts as a pragmatic way and realistic attempt to control prostitution and therefore the venereal diseases that affected their soldiers. Earlier attempts at regulating the men had failed, as they violently objected to being examined for venereal diseases, and their superior officers thought it would demoralize them to subject them to it by force. Prostitutes were considered to lack self-respect and decency, so the Admiralty and the War Office felt they wouldn't be further degraded by such an examination. They also believed that they couldn't stop the men from going to prostitutes, so instead they would make sure the ones they went to were free of disease. It had worked in the colonial territories, why not in Britain itself? The medical establishment saw the Contagious Disease Acts as a progressive sanitation effort. They felt that any steps taken to control the spread of the disease was an asset to public health. Plus, with these measures in place, they had the opportunity to study these previously taboo diseases and hopefully find a cure that wasn't poisonous mercury. Extending the act would also bring about more hospital space in which to treat those sick with venereal disease. They too relied on data from Malta and other colonial territories that suggested a drop in venereal disease did occur under the ordinance. However, the goals of the groups defending the Contagious Disease Act were undermined by their one-sidedness. Prostitutes were only half of the problem. The soldiers and men themselves were also spreading the diseases, sometimes to their wives and unborn children, and even to one another. Without regulating both sides of the issue, the Contagious Disease Acts were never going to fully control the spread of venereal disease, and therefore were not an effective way to protect the troops, or anyone else for that matter. Social reformers fell on both sides of the argument, with some stating that when confronted by an undeniable evil, testing a solution with temporary legislation is the only route to reform, while others proclaimed that these acts sanctioned male infidelity and punished those who had already fallen on hard times and should therefore be repealed. All of these viewpoints were implicit at first, but as tensions rose, these arguments were consciously formulated and defended when the people in support of the act were met with resistance and vice versa. On January 1, 1870, the LNA issued their manifesto to the Daily News, denouncing the Contagious Disease Acts as blatant class and sex discrimination. The Contagious Disease Acts, they stated, deprived poor women of their rights, forced them to submit to degrading internal examinations, and officially sanctioned male vice. They enforced the double standard in which women were persecuted for sex, while men were not. Josephine Butler set out to spread the word about the Contagious Disease Acts in person in 1870. She traveled around 3,700 miles to attend about 100 meetings during that year. Her campaign was focused on working-class men with families, most of whom were outraged when Butler described to them what the forced examinations meant. She called the process surgical rape. By 1871, the LNA had 57 branches and over 800 members. They had published over 500 pamphlets on the acts and the ways in which they exploited the women of the working class. That year, they gained the support of the Royal Commission, which began to inquire with all the bodies that enforced the acts, from the police to the hospitals. That same year, during a meeting of Parliament, there was a motion for the acts to be repealed. Several members of Parliament, or MPs, stated that the acts had been smuggled into law without giving the MPs time to discuss it. In 1883, the House of Commons condemned the compulsory examination of women, which led to the suspension of the Contagious Disease Acts. After 15 years of lobbying and keeping up enthusiasm against the Acts, Parliament consented to repeal the Contagious Disease Acts in Britain in 1884. The regulation of prostitution, which was meant to identify and treat prostitutes, had instead attempted to control the sexuality of all British women, and that was its ultimate downfall. It has been suggested that the Contagious Disease Acts were a trial run for a countrywide regulation of prostitution. Inspector General of Hospitals, R. Lawson, wrote an article in 1891, years after the Acts had been repealed, which stated that the Acts were a most interesting experiment on public health. He went on to discuss the actual effects of the Act through analyzing the recorded rates of venereal disease during its implementation. During and after the Acts, the rates of venereal disease in both towns that were under the Acts and those that were not were tracked and compared. Towns not under the Act showed a higher rate of venereal disease in general, but both towns under the Act and those not under the Act showed the same drop in venereal disease rates between 1860 and 1876, and then both showed a rise between 1878 and 1884. This fall in the rates began before the Acts were passed, and the rise occurred while the Acts were still in effect. Also, the fluctuations occurred in both towns under the Acts and towns not under the Acts, so it's likely the drop in venereal disease occurred due to some factor other than the Acts. Therefore, the impact of the Contagious Disease Acts on the rate of venereal disease is unclear, but the impact it had on society was overall negative, hence the opposition which led to its repeal. Prostitution is not a simple issue to begin with. It has varied causes, permeates all classes, races, and creeds, and has been a method of making money since before written history. Prostitutes have been both detested and desired, feared and pitied. With such a dualistic nature, it's no wonder most legislation attempting to regulate, prevent, and reform it have failed. The Contagious Disease Acts were one of these failed attempts, but in both their establishment and repeal, they also revealed a lot about Victorian society and its various conglomerated cultures. The Contagious Disease Acts showed that when small issues are set aside, peaceful change can be brought, and that is why they bring out the curiosity in us. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media, and please give us a rating on iTunes. Your shares and ratings help us reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who commented, suggested topics, shared MCP posts, liked or followed the MCP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and gave us ratings on iTunes. People like Alexis, Seekmet5, Janitarid, Imogen, Pontifex Podcast, Sky Rules 24, Aaron, Lindsay, Dominic, Delia, Anton, and Autumn. Neve, Jennifer, and Jackie have my eternal gratitude for becoming patrons on Patreon. Thank you. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing, especially on Facebook, so head over there to engage with other listeners, discuss episodes and news articles, and share your own creepy stories and cute pet pictures. The MCP is part of a wider creepy community known as the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. If you'd like some MCP merchandise, an enamel pin was created for the MCP by Rad Girl Creations. If you'd like a pin, go to bit.ly/morbidpin to get yours before we run out. That's bit.ly/morbidpin. As I said before, if you really like the MCP, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can also give one-time donations by going to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com, and clicking the donate button. On our website, you can also find links to all our social media and sponsors, and other ways to contact us. If you'd rather contact us by mail, this address is also listed on the website. Another way to help the show is by going to our Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. On this list are items that will help us improve the podcast, improve our workspace, and some things that are just for fun. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.
Hey, I'm Jake Barton, host of the Historium podcast. Did you ever fall asleep in history class? If so, you are definitely not alone. History can be boring when focusing on only dates and statistics. Historium, on the other hand, seeks out historical narratives in some of the most unlikely of places. Whether it's Julius Caesar being captured by pirates, or Australia losing a war to flightless birds, or radical religious communists taking over a city during the Reformation, or a Russian submariner who saved the world from nuclear annihilation, I bet you haven't heard these stories before. If you're a fan of this podcast, then I'm sure Historium would be right up your alley. You can find Historium wherever you listen to podcasts.